Today we're going to talk about what ASVAB scores you actually need to join each branch of the military and how each branch looks at your ASVAB score to qualify for jobs. Right off the bat, I'm just going to throw this out there that every single branch of the military's minimum ASVAB score is 31, with the exception of the Coast Guard being 40. Now, I know there's going to be some knuckleheads on the comments right away. You're like, Air Force is 50 because that's what the recruiters tell you, but that's not true. The minimum ASVAB requirement for any branch of service is 31. In fact, the Marine Corps is actually the only branch that has a requirement for what percentage of people join that have a 50 or higher. The Marine Corps requires that 65% of their applicants have at least a 50 on the ASVAB. That means 2 out of every 3 people, roughly, who join the Marine Corps need to have a 50 or higher on the ASVAB. In fact, when I was a recruiter for the Marine Corps, I had a recruiter in my office who had dropped below what we call the alpha percentage, because they call anything 50 plus on the ASVAB is called an alpha, and anything 50 minus is called a bravo, and then anything 31 or below is called a cat 4, which is like, hey, sorry, we can't enlist you right now. And there are some exceptions to that, which we'll talk about. But this recruiter dropped below 65. He was at like 50%. So like every other person he enlisted had below a 50. And he actually got told one day, hey, we know that you have this applicant who wants to join the military, is physically qualified, and is ready to go. You can't enlist him until you enlist 3 people who got a 50 or higher because your score is too low. And so what ended up happening was we had to swap so that I technically recruited the kid who didn't have a 50, and he technically recruited the kid who did have a 50 to try to swap and help him get above that percentage again so that he could begin recruiting people again, because the Marine Corps really does have a requirement for that. Now, I don't know if the other branches have some official requirement like that, but to my knowledge, the Marine Corps is the only one with a certain percentage set in stone that they hold their recruiters to over 50. All of the other branches, it's individual recruiters who, if they're doing well, they'll try to pad their own scores by saying, yeah, I've got this percentage of people who are over 50, but there's not actually a minimum. Now, the Air Force likes to tell people that 50 is the minimum required score for them, but that's not true. Now, the reality is that there's enough people who walk into the Air Force recruiting offices that they have the luxury of kind of saying yes and no to who they want. And they will just tell people, sorry, we can't help you because you got below a 50, and tell them it's the Air Force's requirements when the recruiters just don't want to work with you. Because again, the bottom official score for every branch is 31. Now, the Navy sometimes tells people 35, but officially it's 31. And the Air Force technically will tell people 36 based on some job sets, but again, it's still 31. The Coast Guard, however, does have a 40 minimum, and that is their, I guess their thing, but also their Department of Homeland Security rather than Department of Defense, so, who knows? Another note here is that the Army actually waives people below 31, these Cat 4. Every year when I was a recruiter, when they were starting to get close to the end of the year and they were cutting it close on mission, they would open it up to 23 and above, which is an ASVAB waiver, a Category 4, and they would run the waiver. But more recently, what they've started doing is they have basically a pre-bootcamp, which they call the Future Soldier Preparatory Course. And basically, if you're out of shape or haven't passed the ASVAB, they'll send you to this course for, I think it's 12 weeks, and you have until that time to get in shape and pass the ASVAB, and then you start boot camp. So it's like, if you make it, great. If not, I don't know if they recycle you or just say, hey, sorry. And so they'll set you in a classroom and just make you study, math, English, until you get to the spot where you pass, and then they let you in, which admittedly probably does have a decently high success rate because it's forcing people to study on just the same thing that helps them pass the test. The question there for me is, are they really getting to a spot where they're intelligent enough to be qualified for what you'd want in the military? Or are they just learning how to take the test and really you're letting people in who you probably don't want serving? I don't know, but this is a new thing for them that's helping them meet mission, and it seems like a decent idea, so we will see how it goes. But again, 31 minimum across the board with the exception of the Coast Guard, unless you have a GED. Now, it used to be that homeschoolers required a 50 on the ASVAB in order to join. I was one of those. I had to have a 50 on the ASVAB to join because I'd been homeschooled. But that rule went away, actually, I think before I was a recruiter, and it hasn't been a rule for probably 10 years. However, if you have a GED rather than a high school diploma, then the requirement still kicks in where you do need that 50 on the ASVAB. Again, there is one exception to this. The Coast Guard will take down to a 47 with a GED if you have 15 college credits. Now we're going to dig into the actual ASVAB score a little bit more, because that top line ASVAB score, which is called the AFQT, which is the Armed Forces Qualification Test score, that's your overall score, and that's what decides your eligibility for the military as a whole. Again, 31, 50 being kind of those benchmarks for whether or not you can join, and depending on how your recruiters operate. But underneath that, we have what's called line scores, and every branch of the military looks at this a little bit differently, but these are the scores that actually help determine what jobs you'd be best suited for, your aptitude, and help get you into those careers. For example, in the Marine Corps, we count your EL, which is your electrical, your ST, which is your skilled technical requirement, your CL, which is your clerical, and your GT, which is your general technical. Those 4 scores are what we compile to decide what MOS you can join. And so a lot of these will have like a specific CL, EL, ST score, and then also maybe a GT. So for example, you have to have like a 105 GT to go into like MARSOC or Recon or some of these special forces or high-end job fields. But then on some of the other stuff, like if you're going to be an electrician, they're going to have a minimum EL score. So you might have a high ASVAB score and still not be set up to be an electrician. And that's how they kind of determine your job as opposed to just your aptitude and your qualification for joining the service. And again, every branch of the service uses different language for what they look for there, and they all kind of break out a little bit differently. But the bottom line is you're going to get your AFQT score, which is what qualifies you for the military. And then under that, each branch will see different line items for different job fields. And when you look at those, that's going to determine what jobs you're eligible for. So your recruiter will give you a list of jobs based on your line scores that says this is what you'd be best suited for. And that's how that works. Now, the bummer here is that all the math and English in the world you study won't help you as far as which line scores you get. So you can't necessarily study specifically for the line scores, because this is testing whether or not you're better suited for electrical or clerical, or like what kind of jobs you'd be good at in your job field. And I'll tell you that they don't correlate. Like I've seen people who got a 35 on the ASVAB qualify for every job in the Marine Corps, and I've seen people who got a 60 on the ASVAB not qualify for every job on the Marine Corps, because again, those line scores do not correlate to your overall score. So now again, just for the people who weren't quite listening in the back, Army, Navy, Air Force, Marine Corps, 31 is your minimum required score. Space Force falls in with the Air Force because they go to the same boot camp, they have the same requirements. Coast Guard, 40 is your minimum. All of those branches, if you have a GED, 50 is now your minimum, 47 for the Coast Guard if you have 15 college credits. That's it. After that, all the line scores split out differently to help you decide what kind of job fields you'd be eligible for, where you should focus your effort, what career sets you'd most likely find success in, and that's the breakout. And if you want to know more about how to study for the ASVAB and actually how to set yourself up for success, check out this video in which I teach you exactly what I used to tell all of my applicants to study for the ASVAB. It's really not that complicated if you don't overthink it. So click on that, take a watch, and have a great day.